All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is the Rick Collins Masterclass. Welcome. Avoiding legal nightmares like a champ. A few years ago, I had a case involving a New York resident who drove down to Mexico. He was a teacher, and he wanted to pick up some anabolics for his friends and gym buddies. So he went down to Mexico, he picked up a whole lot of anabolic steroid gear, put it in the trunk of his car, and was driving back from Mexico. Came across the land border, not a problem. Suddenly in Mississippi, a state trooper pulls up behind him, pulls him over. Now he had New York plates, and he was driving in the left lane for a period of time, and that was arguably the reason why he was stopped, that he didn't move into the right lane. I think it might have had more to do with his having New York plates in Mississippi. So the Mississippi trooper comes out, rolls down the window, and he says to what became my client, "Where are you coming from?" He says, "Well, I'm coming from down in Mexico, just seeing some friends." "You have anything in the car you want to declare?" He said, "No, I have nothing in the car." "No drugs in the car?" "Nope. Okay. You mind if I take a look in the trunk?" He says, "You know what? I'm a teacher. I'm educated on the law. I don't consent to your searching my trunk." Trooper goes, "Well, okay now. Well, here's what we're going to do. I am going to call the K-9 unit. And K-9 unit's going to come. And if they smell any drugs in that trunk, it's going to be bad. So I'm giving you another opportunity. Can you let me in that trunk now?" He says, "You know what? I'm going to stand on my rights. I'm not going to have the trunk searched." Okay. So the trooper calls the K-9 unit. It's going to be about 20 minutes till the K-9 unit gets there. Meanwhile, trooper's kind of working on him. He's like, "Yeah, you know, that dog, he's mean. He's mean. I've seen him when he hits on a trunk. I've seen him just destroy a car. He scratches it. He ruins the paint. He's a terrible, angry dog. You sure you don't want to have that, trunk searched now?" He goes, "I'm sure." Okay. K-9 unit comes. Handler comes out. Dog walks around the car twice and sits down. Doesn't do anything else. He hears some conversation between the trooper and the K-9 handler where he believes the K-9 handler says, "We ain't got shit." Trooper comes over, he says, "Open your trunk, it's a hit." He goes, "It's a hit?" He said, "Ain't got shit." "No," he said, "It's a hit." "Wait a minute, that's not what I heard." "Well, you better open the trunk because the dog just hit on your trunk." Open up the trunk of the car, and lo and behold, there's a lot of anabolic steroids in there. So he gets charged in Mississippi, a New Yorker in Mississippi, with the possession of all of these steroids with the intent to sell them. Case winds up actually going to trial. Mississippi jury, probably not wild about a New Yorker bringing these drugs through Mississippi. He's convicted at trial. We appeal, and ultimately the appellate court throws it all out. And the appellate court says, "You didn't have a good basis for stopping him. He's just driving in the left lane. This was a spurious ruse stop." In terms of, did the dog really hit on the trunk? So I wound up calling a whole lot of different canine specialists from across the country. Some of them said that in theory, a dog could be trained on certain synthetic anabolic steroids, but I could not document anywhere in the United States, nowhere, that a dog was ever trained on that. And in this case, they did introduce records indicating that the dog had been trained on anabolic steroids. And the anabolic steroid was Winstrol. It just said Winstrol. And that would happen to be the steroid that was most prevalent in the trunk. And I could find no evidence that the dog had ever been actually trained on Winstrol. In fact, I suspect, and I think the appellate court may have suspected as well, something that they saw in the trunk and wrote it in. A scary, scary thing. Luckily, it went the right way at the end of the day, but it just goes to show you that the real world, in terms of black market steroids, you really can wind up in a bad place. By way of just brief introduction, in the late 90s, I started a website to kind of bridge the gap between the folks in the gyms who were using anabolic steroids for primarily cosmetic reasons, to aesthetic reasons, to build up, to gain muscle. I started writing a column in Muscular Development magazine, published a book called Legal Muscle in 2002. I maintain a website at Supplement Council for anabolic steroids. And I have to tell you, I love what I do. And I have friends who are lawyers. They all complain to me that they don't like what they do. I do. I get up in the morning and I love it. I've met some of the most interesting people. A few of them up there, you may recognize some folks from UFC, from film. Every one of them I've spent some time with, and every one of them is quite a decent fellow, with the exception of one, and I won't say who that is. You may have some suspicions because his reputation is not so good. That in the corner on the right, that's Sam Solomon. I'll tell you a little about him later. I met Arnold Schwarzenegger before he was governor back in the day at the Arnold Classic, which is the big bodybuilding show that he started with Jim Lorimer many years ago. Look, I come from a background as a bodybuilder. I was a competitive bodybuilder, so I remember growing up and watching Arnold movies and watching Pumping Iron and just loving everything about this guy, just a hero to me. And so when I had the opportunity to meet him in 2002, 20 years ago, for the first time, I was so excited. I was meeting him backstage and was being introduced, and suddenly there he is walking up, larger than life, and he walks up to me and I'm standing there and they're like, Arnold Schwarzenegger, this is Rick Collins. And I do a little impression of him. And I don't know, in the moment, it just kind of bubbled out, you know, in the excitement of the moment. And as he put his hand out and I put my hand out, I said, "It's super fantastic to meet you." And he looks at me and he's like, "You do an impression of me?" I'm like, "I do." He goes, "It's good." And I once had the opportunity to spend a whole day with him in his office in Venice, in Santa Monica. Just an amazing icon for bodybuilding. The disclaimers in fine print, obviously, laws and regulations can sometimes be open to interpretation. So I always give the disclaimer that, you know, these are my personal views and not legal advice. So I'm going to go through just a few things to think about in terms of protecting yourself from the legal nightmares. Starting off with, don't think being a bodybuilder doesn't put a target on your back. We had a conversation during lunch about the trans community and the accessibility of testosterone to those who are assigned female at birth but seeking to transition or to become less binary or more non-binary. And so that's just a little joke that's circulating around social media. For those of you who want I've given a lecture, extended lecture on sort of the history of why testosterone and other anabolic steroids are controlled substances Schedule III in the United States. And it goes way back to the story of a very accomplished Olympic athlete in the 1988 Seoul Olympics by the name of Ben Johnson, a Canadian who was in the 100 meters, broke all the records and then tested positive for Winstrol, actually, for stanozolol, and then was disgraced because he had beaten the American Carl Lewis, and sports press went absolutely crazy, and Congress started holding hearings about the unfair playing field that was created if athletes begin this chemical arms race for performance. And so Congress took the option of making anabolic steroids, including testosterone, a controlled substance, both at the federal level, and many states changed their own state laws to parrot the federal law. And so people can get in trouble for possession or sale of an anabolic steroid in the same way that they would get in trouble if they were selling cocaine or methamphetamine or other drugs that are also maybe different levels of scheduling, but all within the 5 schedules of the Controlled Substances Act. And to give you an example of that, I remember a few years ago I got a phone call from a woman in a Western state who called me and said, "You got to help me, Rick. I need your help." I said, "What's happening?" "Well, I'm charged with selling an anabolic steroid. And I did not sell any anabolic steroids. And they're trying to force me to plead guilty, and I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do." I said, "Okay." So the context was she is a competitive bodybuilder, female bodybuilder, very large woman, makes me look small, certainly lower body fat. And so no question that she was an anabolic steroid user, no issue. Visually, would be tough to refute that argument. But that doesn't mean she's an anabolic steroid seller. And she had a gym, a small personal training gym in a little rural area in this western state. And what she was charged with was selling one vial, one 10cc vial of testosterone to an undercover informant for $100. All right, she goes, I didn't do it. So I call up the prosecutor and introduce myself and say, this woman is charged with something that she tells me she didn't do. Prosecutor says, well, she's full of it because her case is she's dead to rights. Here's what happens. We have an undercover informant who's working off his own anabolic steroid case. He tells us that she's selling anabolic steroids out of her gym. He has a conversation with her. Now, that conversation is not recorded. He has a conversation by phone where he says, hey, I'm going to come down to your gym. Can you put me on a training program? And she says, sure. Can you put me on a diet that'll get me in better shape? She says, sure. Can you get me some anabolic steroids? She says, okay. Tell you what I'll do. I will sell you one vial of testosterone for $100. And what I'll do is I'll take that vial and I will put it in a bottle of multivitamins and sell you that for $100. That's how we'll hide it. So he calls up the officer that he's working with, the detective, who then the next day gives him $100, wires him up, lets him drive his own car to the gym. Guy gets to the gym, he goes inside, he has a conversation, he's wired up with the woman, and at the end of that conversation, he leaves, he comes to the detective, he pulls out of his pocket a bottle of multivitamins, the detective takes it, he unscrews the lid, he reaches in, and guess what he pulls out? A vial of testosterone. So we then 2 or 3 weeks later, the prosecutor tells me, we go to her house. We go inside, we execute a search warrant, and guess what we find? Anabolic steroids. We find anabolic steroids in a nightstand in her bedroom, which she shares with her husband, who's a competitive powerlifter. So the way we look at it is she meets the criteria for the 3 strikes and you're outlaw. The phone call that sets up the deal, strike 1, drug call. Strike 2, the transaction itself. Strike 3, the search warrant return with the anabolic steroids in the house. 3 strikes, she's looking at 10 years. 10 years in prison for 1 vial of testosterone. Now, I know she's never been in trouble before, so I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'll let her plead guilty to a felony with probation, but she's got to take the felony. And she'll get probation, not a day in jail, but she's got to take 5 years probation. Okay, I call her back. I'm like, this is serious stuff. They're talking about 10 years. If we try this case and we lose, you're looking at a 10-year sentence. She says to me, I don't care. I will do 10 years. I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. I did not sell this vial. So there were 2 things that actually helped me in that case. One is that you are entitled to discovery. So I was able to get the tape recording of the conversation that occurred during the transaction. I listened to it. I let my partners listen to it. I let my receptionist listen to it because I wanted to make sure that what I was hearing was what everybody else heard. Number 2, this was one of the few states, and here in the United States, you generally survive trial by ambush from the prosecution standpoint. But in this state, I was actually entitled to depose the witnesses before trial. So I asked to depose the confidential informant and the detective. I wanted to talk to them. I could ask them questions before we went to trial. So I took both of those routes. And I flew to this state and I drove through the mountains into this tiny little village, and I had local counsel, which I often bring in. And local counsel, the night before the deposition, the local counsel basically was trying to strong-arm this woman into taking a plea. You're crazy. What are you doing? You take probation. She was steadfast against it. So we show up the next day. I get to the courthouse. I see the prosecutor, who's this young Mormon boy, probably 25, if that. And he says, oh, I got bad news. I'm like, what's the bad news? Yeah, the confidential informant isn't available today. So I'm like, I just flew from New York, drove through the mountains. I'm here to depose the witness. You're telling me this morning, this is not a good thing. He's like, well, you could come back another day. I can bring him in next week or the week after. I'm not coming back here next week or the week after. He's like, well, the offer of probation expires in 3 weeks. So if you don't come back and do it or plead guilty within the 3 weeks, it's a 10-year sentence. So I'm like, I can't get back here in 3 weeks. I got other cases. I've got other things to do. This is not going to work. And yet, on the other hand, I don't want to reject it because I want to hear from what these witnesses say before I fully reject this offer and how to advise her on it. So I say, all right, can you get them by phone? He goes, yeah. So I'm like, I don't think in the history of American jurisprudence there's ever been a deposition by phone like this. But I figured under the circumstances, I had to do it. So sure enough, we get the snitch, the confidential informant on the phone. And I ask him a bunch of questions. And I find out he's working off his own case. And the way it works very often in criminal justice is somebody gets in trouble for a crime, and then they try to point fingers at others and give others up in order to get some leniency on their own sentencing. And he was being offered the deal that if he could find 3 people to set up, he would go from a felony for his distribution of anabolic steroids down to a misdemeanor. He had set up 1 person, and that person was like 8 months earlier. So clearly he was probably getting pressure saying, look, if you can't set somebody else up, it may just have to be the felony for you. Based on her physical appearance, kind of low-hanging fruit, right? So if you've got somebody charged with anabolic steroids who looks like they might be using anabolic steroids in front of a jury, this might not play well. Well, I ask him all of those questions. I also bring out that he's not fully searched before he goes into her gym, and that he was able to drive there himself, and that he claims that he had this conversation with her, and I could hear it on the tape. The tape, he sits down, he says, can you write me a training program? Absolutely, and great, and can you give me a diet? Yes. Do you recommend some supplements? Yes, I recommend this multivitamin. It's a multivitamin that has these huge green pills, huge green tablets. And what about steroids? On the tape, what about steroids? And on the tape, she says, look, steroids are part of bodybuilding at the highest levels. Don't necessarily recommend them, but you could reach a point where it's good. And then he says, well, how about those multivitamins? Where are those? Oh yeah, I'll get those for you. So it's equivocal as to whether this really was a drug conversation or not. You then hear him go to the counter. Now, he claims he gave her $100, okay? She says to me, he gave me $20 for the multivitamins. He never gave me $100. So I ask him the question, you say you gave $100? Yes. $100 for the drugs inside this multivitamin? Yes. She didn't ring it up in the cash register. Well, no. Well, you're not going to ring up a drug transaction and record it in a cash register, right? Well, no. That would be crazy, right? Yes. That's not what happened, right? Right. He didn't realize she had given me a cash register receipt for $20, time-coded to their conversation, to him standing at that counter. So I already had him, but that wasn't all I had, because I then asked him, so now you claim you had this vial of testosterone in a bottle of multivitamins, right? Right. That's the evidence, right? That's what you were sent in for, correct? Yes. And you understand that you had to bring that to the detective, right? Right. Because that's the evidence he wanted, right? Yes. So you went directly to him and brought him that evidence, right? Oh, yeah. You didn't go anywhere else, did you? Well, I had to go to the bathroom. Wait a minute. So you went to the bathroom with the bottle? Well, yes. No one else in the bathroom other than you and that bottle? Right. You went in there? Yes. You closed the door? Yes. You locked the door? Yes. What he didn't realize, idiot, was that the tape was running the whole time. You hear him go into the bathroom, and that's why I let everybody I know listen, because I wanted to make sure that I was hearing it right. You hear him go in the bathroom. You hear him take his keys and put them on the porcelain of the sink. You hear a wrapper of cellophane as it's being taken off of a bottle. You hear the scooping of pills hitting the porcelain of the bowl as he scoops out enough of those big green vitamins to hit to make room for the testosterone bottle. And I say to him, so wait a minute, you had to go to the bathroom so bad that you couldn't wait just 5 minutes? No, I had to go so bad. You had to go so bad that you actually took the evidence with you into the men's room? Well, yes. Oh my God, was it number 1 or number 2? He goes, number 1. So your bladder was so engorged that you had to go in there and urinate before bringing this evidence, this crucial evidence, to the detective. Oh, yes, I had to go so bad. What he didn't realize was one thing you don't hear on the tape. A drop. Not one drop. And when that comes out, suddenly his demeanor changes on the phone. And he says to me, I don't like the way this is going. I said, I can understand that because there's a name for it. He's, what's that? I said, it's called perjury. That's just what you've done. I'm calling my lawyer. Hangs up the phone. The little Mormon prosecutor is looking at me. His face is as white as a sheet. And he says, would you take a misdemeanor? I said, okay. Here's how this is going to go. You're going to dismiss this entire case. You're going to apologize for this complete miscarriage of justice that you've been involved in. And I'm going to talk her into not suing you, the detective, and your entire DA's office. And he goes, I could live with that. And that was the end of it. But and I've written a few articles about this because there's so many instructive lessons to be learned from this, both from the prosecution side of how to prevent a rogue informant from actually making it appear as if a crime occurred when there was no crime. The only crime was perjury. That was the only crime that occurred. She committed no crime whatsoever. It's not even that somebody else committed a crime. There was no crime. He manufactured it. So these are the sorts of examples of cases that I get involved in, and I do love what I do.